Recording in progress.
Serious. Good evening, everyone. Can you hear? Yeah, is it working? Okay, good evening, everyone, on this very special event, very special evening occasion, the hybrid book launch of Attila Melegh's book, most recent book, which, as you know, the title is The Migration Turn and Eastern Europe, a Global Historical Sociological Analysis, which was recently published by the Palgrave Macmillan Publishing House. This is a joint event organized by the Karl Polányi Center, by the Eszmélet Journal, by the College for Advanced Studies in Social Theory, and by the Department of Sociology of the Corvinus University of Budapest. Many thanks to the Corvin Hotel for giving us the opportunity to be here and to organize the event here. I am Beata Nagy. I have the privilege of being the moderator for this event. Let me share with you the schedule with the program for this event. First, I'm going to introduce the distinguished guests, the distinguished speakers. And after their introduction, I asked Attila to summarize the main statements of his book. No? Yes. Yes, we agreed on that. So he will start with his main statements, and after listening to him, the invited guest speakers will comment on the topic of migration turn and Attila's book. And of course, Attila will have the opportunity to react on the comments and on the questions, and then we are going to give the floor to the audience, and you have the opportunity to raise questions. I would like to start with the introduction of the guests. And as it is a hybrid event, some of them are online and some of us are here on site. So I would like to start, and I hope that we can see Chris Hahn. Can you hear? Yeah. Hi, Chris. It's a strange situation. So Chris Hahn is Emeritus Director of the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology. Chris Hahn has worked on as an economic anthropologist in Hungary since the mid-1970s. He is the author of the Tázla, A Village in Hungary, published in 1980, and Repatriating Polányi, Market Society in the Visegrad States, published in 2019. The next speaker will be József Böröc. József is a professor of sociology at Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey, one of the founders of the Karl Polanyi Center for Global Social Studies. He is the author, co-author, and editor of 8 books and over 90 scholarly papers in a number of languages, including the European Union and Global Social Change, published by the Routledge in 2009, and the Euro-White Conceit and the Dirty White Ressentiment, Race in Europe, published in the Sociological Forum 2021. The third guest, who intended to be here on site, but finally she's also online, is Petra Ezedin. She is a social anthropologist and assistant professor at the Department of Social and Cultural Anthropology, Charles University in Prague. Her research focuses on migration, transnational care practices, globalization of care, aging in migration, with special focus on the Central and Eastern European region. She is a research fellow in the research program Global Conflicts and Local Interactions at the Czech Academy of Sciences, and a member of the editorial board for the Gender and Research Journal in Prague. She cooperates closely with several Czech and Slovak non-governmental and international organizations working with migrant women. And we are lucky to have here Prem Kumar Rajaram not online but offline. Prem is a professor of sociology and social anthropology at Central European University and co-founder and program director of the Open Learning Initiative, OLIVE, which provides education opportunities for displaced people. His research is on migration, colonialism, and capitalism and their intersections. He is the co-editor of Opening Up the University, Teaching and Learning with Refugees, published by Berghahn 2022, and author of Ruling the Margins, Colonialism and Administrative Rule in the Past and Present, published by the Routledge 2014. Last but not least, Salvatore Angel di Mauro, who is online too, is professor and chair of the Geography Department and Environmental Studies of State University of New York at New Paltz. His most recent books are Socialist States and Environment and Urban Food Production of Eco-Socialism, written together with Martin. His recent areas include soil contamination and acidification, urban food production, dialectical materialism, and socialism and environment. He teaches courses on physical geography, gender and environment, people-environment relations, socialism, and soils. He is senior editor of Capitalism, Nature, Socialism, and reviews editor for Human Geography. And as I mentioned, I am Berta Nagy. I work for the Corvinus University of Budapest at the Sociology Department. I'm the president of the Hungarian Sociological Association. My topic is gender and work, and I'm the academic director of the Sociology Master Program at Corvinus. So after these introductory words, I call Attila to summarize the main statements of his book.
Thank you very much. It is indeed a great privilege to sit here. And I think the reason why we are sitting here is not exactly the book, but we are sitting here because we have been working together on a number of issues which have become rather important in recent sociological, historical, sociological, anthropological work. And very frankly, I would say that all the people sitting in front of me and sitting online back to me have been doing in very important contributions to this. And this book is nothing else but some kind of a contribution to a debate which has been going on. The whole idea of the book came in 2015 with the refugee crisis. I remember it was in the beginning, we were watching the figures, the visions, and so on and so on, and then we could see that something has started. I was absolutely not aware of the scale of this event, and I was not aware of the consequences of this event at that time at all. Nonetheless, I had the feeling, and then actually 2015 in summer, I started making a plan for a book. And then I made the plan, but of course, I had to work a lot, so it started later. And then in 2017, I actually started working on the whole project. The good thing in the whole story was that I had no idea really what the outcome would. Generally, there are two ways of writing. One is that you have an idea what comes out of the whole story. And this one was, no, I had an idea of a method, how to go into a problem. And then I started this adventure, which proved to be rather long, but in the end, this is why we are sitting here, because I could get to some point. So to summarize, I've been asked to summarize. It's not so easy. Once I remember Professor Bertalan, when he was commenting Rudolf Andorka's statement when he got the academy position at the Hungarian Academy, then when he summed up that, oh, this author said this and this, and then Professor Bertalan turned to me and said, oh, my dear, in case that could have been told in one sentence, why the author wrote 600 pages, right? And I think there was a point in this. So, nonetheless, I try to give you some key points which have been important for me, and I'm eager to listen to my distinguished friends, colleagues, whose imprint is very clear on the book as well, and from whom I've just learned a lot. So this is, in some ways, it's not a sociological book. This is some kind of a historical book. So my idea was to go into a historical dynamic analysis because I could see that the historical background and the historical dynamic is super important in this story, and therefore we cannot make easy conclusions based on some cross-sectional or just some structural arguments, and I will say why. Then the idea was the following, and in that sense, I wanted to really follow a Marxist line. And actually, this is one of the reasons why it got into this series, is because what I understood that one of the major contributions of Marxism, or very importantly Marx, was to make a turn in which ideational processes, ideological processes, and historical social material processes have to be analyzed parallelly. We have to see all the time the interactions between, and all things have to go back into history. And then we have to understand the engines of history in this way. That is to say, how internal tensions and how various problems lead to new problems in society. Plus, very importantly, they were the ones, and in that sense, I learned a lot also from other authors who are very important. I will come back to that immediately. But very importantly, Gramsci and Lukács was also important, namely that we have to put back ideas back into the history as well. And then you could see that in the book, very consciously, I was trying to work on certain cognitive structures and then to get really good evidence globally, not just accidentally, but systematic global knowledge of certain things. So that was, I think, one thing. The other point is, and I'm so glad that Chris is sitting beside me, is of course Karl Polanyi. Because from the very beginning, I had only one clear understanding, namely that we have to look for something which we can call a marketization process or an attempt to create certain market utopias which can lead to the kind of a nationalism which was on the rise. But of course, Polanyi it was a very good, I mean, in case you read The Great Transformation, you can see how beautifully he analyzes the double movement, which is not a micro level story, but some kind of a macro level overall reaction of the society to development. And in the beginning, I did not understand Polanyi correctly because I was just focusing on this nationalism. So I started writing about this newly emerging anti-migrant nationalism. And then I understood in the end, it took some time, that I got on the wrong path because you have to see the interaction of this nationalism with another bloc, which is promoting market, which is promoting the marketization of migration, and which is promoting an idea of kind of a marketized consciousness. That is to say that we have to make everything some kind of calculus, a market calculus. Migration is to be calculated. How many $1 trillion can be earned in case we let immigration go ahead? And then when I got this, then I understood that I was on the right track. This is not the whole story because we have this very much this pro-market bloc versus a pro-market bloc, but which is for nationalist control. And of course, this is not the complete story because there are some other possible perspectives in society which already exist. And then we have to see the dynamics among them, and then this is what we need to understand. And then the key point for me was to, because that I think is missing, very often we have very Polanyian essays when people claim certain things, I really wanted to see the mechanisms. Therefore, I started some kind of a systematic work. The book starts with the analysis of population discourses in the 1980s, which is the onset of the so-called marketization or globalization process. And then I was trying to locate how in population policies and population discourses migration actually showed up. And then the main outcome of that was that it was these population discourses, which existed for at least 100 years before, these population discourses handled migration in a very ambivalent way. Therefore, they could not really swallow it. They were undecided what to do with this. And I think that was something very important for me. So, for instance, the Malthusian discourse, on the one hand, promoted migration and wanted to see that. On the other hand, it was very much afraid of large-scale immigration. So it's very ambivalent. And then I thought that that would be a good starting for the meaning structure into which globalization comes. And then the next point, the chapter 3 of the book, is mainly about the following problem: is that how we can actually explain the rise and the intensification of migration, because it's actually not so easy to explain. And then I had some guiding lines in this, very importantly Saskia Sassen, saying that marketization, the opening up of the economies, foreign direct investment can be a very important factor in increasing emigration, therefore increasing migration levels as well. And then with Zoli sitting here, and we started working and modeling a lot on this, whether it can be proven or not. And then the very good outcome was that we could systematically show that these assumptions, namely the original Polanyian assumption that marketization is making a transformative change in society, could be really demonstrated. But of course, it was not enough, because I wanted to work in a very systematic manner geographically as well. So I looked at the local process, the global processes. I was looking for the key factors, and then from the key factors, I started going down to regions. So what was special about Europe in this globalization process? And then there is a long discussion and a lot of empirical material, how the spatial migratory structures, how the actual historical dynamics of migration within Europe has been changing. Of course, having in mind that why in Europe this migration debate blew up completely. And then I could find some very interesting points, which you can read in the book, but I don't want to take the floor for too long, so I'm not going to that into details. And then, of course, my ultimate focus was Eastern Europe. So why Eastern Europe has become so important to this. And then, I had the model in head, so I could then work on, I call them migratory capitalisms, some kind of a trajectories of East European societies, how they went through this process. Because the structural position of Eastern Europe as a semi-periphery was not a good enough explanation for a whole lot of differences among these countries. So I think one of the key points I could find at the end, that these East European countries, so Romania and Hungary is not the same. Structurally speaking, we are producing very similar things, but even in material levels, the situation is different, and on cognitive levels, even much more so. And I think that was very important. Just to give you one example, I could find the Central European region as being not so much emigrant, keeping some welfare systems in the society, while there was an emigrant Eastern Europe, which was completely neoliberal, cutting social services massively, leading to a massive emigration, and so on. And then this whole story became interesting because I wanted to understand the cognitive development. And here came really the juice of the story in some ways, because that was really exciting to see. And then I started once again on a global level, on a European level, and on an East European level. And then very soon I'm finishing. And then I found very interesting things. One was that I would have bet, I don't know how many beers on that during globalization, public anti-migrant attitudes would go up globally. And I started looking at the data. I looked at the world value survey, and then I was putting together the things. And then I said, no, it is not. I looked at it again. No, it is not going up. And then I looked at on a regional level. And on a regional level, I found the following. The so-called West was rather open, together very importantly with Latin America. Then I could see Asia has been rather worried about immigration. Africa actually started opening up in some ways, but there was one characteristic story. Eastern Europe, from a very low level, went up dramatically. And then I could see that this was really Polanyi for me, that there is some kind of a societal reaction here, which we need to look at. And then I looked at even the European data, and surprise, surprise, till 2019 and 20, on an overall European level, these attitudes are not really changing. So it's much more stubborn than we would think. What about Eastern Europe? And then came really something, so I could come close to my own country as well. And then I could see that there is an enormous variation in Eastern Europe. So similar structural position, in some ways a somewhat similar story, that is to say, from the embedded economies of socialism. They went into, and actually it was unprecedentedly clear based on the data, into a super open status. So East European countries, globally speaking, are the ones which are not only super open, but actually both in out migration and both in foreign direct investment, they are well above any global average. Even Latin America is behind that. So I could see that there is this structural position, but the reaction is not the same. And I think that's important. Because the Central European region, and here I could see that how material and non-material things were getting together, that these societies had some distinctive features. One, they were rather well off under socialism. Second, as Bolek Leszkowicz also pointed out, they were following some embedded neoliberalism. Therefore, there was a continuous attempt to maintain some welfare systems. And these societies, based on other things, are very competitive in mindset. That is to say, they are very worried about losing any kind of a welfare benefit or any kind of an anxiety on that level. And then I could see this in the book. I worked on this kind of a migrant competition, which was here not because of the Orban government, but it was here already in the 1990s, very clearly. Plus, very importantly, we always forget that in the early 2000s, the Socialist Party was actually using the migrant card massively and very successfully in the country, which is about this competitive feeling and this competitive anxiety. The emigrant Eastern Europe is a different story. Actually, Estonia was close to the Central European one. The emigrant parts of Poland, Romania, showing very distinct characteristics in this. So just one example, and actually that was a clue to me, and this is where I'm going to finish, which led me to the issue of some demographic anxieties as well, is that the emigrant Eastern Europe is far more open in terms of attitudes. They may have similar political discourses, but the data is significantly different. So my good friend Tamás Kiss made a survey concerning Romania, Hungarians in Romania, and the Hungarian society here in Hungary. And then we compared the following situation came back. The Romanian respondents were rather open. The respondents in Hungary massively not open, but overall the Hungarian minority was on top of everything. Actually, I think it was 85%, which was something worried about whether neighborhood would change for an immigrant worker. And I think that was some kind of a clue to me, because then I really understood that this small language communities in the midst of an amazing marketization attempt and the consequent insecurity, the consequent competitiveness can lead to the hegemony or the, let's put it in some ways, or a counter-hegemony of some nationalist discourses, which we could see. And I think that was very important for me because this was the experience I've been living through between 2015 and 2022 when I finished the book. There are many other points, but of course, we don't have time for that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Attila. I think it was absolutely crucial that you summarized the main points. And now we have a very good starting point for the next point, which is the distinguished speakers, the issue of migration turn on the one hand, and Attila's book, of course. So I would like to call Chris Hahn to start with the comments.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me in Budapest and online.
Yeah.
I very much wish I could be with you, but I'm not. I'm in Cambridge. I am rather overwhelmed by the richness of Attila's project. And so, as a social anthropologist, I am going to follow a very simple strategy and retreat to my fieldwork settings in southern Hungary. But before I do that, apologies to everybody. I hear a terrible echo. Is the echo disturbing other people? It's not something I can control, I'm afraid. It sounds better now. That's great. Thank you. I will continue. As I say, it is a daunting task to comment on this book because of its very richness. But I would like to take up Attila's first point in the presentation about historical dynamics, super important, as he said, and I can only agree. Let me start by mentioning a couple of his intellectual heroes. There are several in the book, and I can't deal with all of them, but Polányi, of course, is very close to my heart. Attila, you did not say much about Lukács in these few minutes, but he is also very important for your book. And of course, here I am beside the Cam in East Anglia. I can't help thinking of the Danube and the wonderful intellectual life of the late Austro-Hungarian Empire, when Polányi and Lukács were contemporaries in very important contributors to the intellectual life of Budapest before the First World War. Now, those individuals have their own very interesting migration histories, their families. They both spent much of their life in exile, Polányi rather more. I am, of course, delighted that, Attila, you are picking up on some of Polányi's ideas, and the step from his notion of labor as fictitious commodity to marketization as also a commodity in some sense. I find that fascinating. I don't think Polányi actually wrote much about migration processes, not anywhere in the world, and certainly not in his home region of Central Europe. But perhaps I'm wrong about that. Perhaps someone will correct me in the discussion. Now, my joke, if you like, the game, the conceit of this little presentation lasting a few minutes. What would Polányi and Lukács make of the situation we find ourselves in today? What Attila is calling the migration turn. Because although he paid due homage to history in his opening remarks, the rest of his comments and the greater part of the book, they are concerned with developments in recent decades, with developments in political economy, and also with developments in politics and in the discourses. But in terms of history, Attila, you paid rather more attention to the discourses, going back to Malthus, than you did to capitalist political economy over centuries in Eastern Europe and elsewhere. Let me just take you to a region that I know you are personally familiar with in southern Hungary, because you worked on the historical demography of Kiskunhalas earlier in your career. You looked at its population dynamics over centuries, 18th, 19th centuries primarily. using the records of the churches there. And I did something not remotely comparable, but I looked at the history of a village very close by. So these are small settlements in the southern part of the Great Hungarian Plain, between the Danube and the Tisza, for those of you who know your Hungarian geography. And I found, when I did fieldwork in Dazlar in the 1970s, that very few members of the community, numbering about 2,000, could trace more than a few generations of residents in that part of Hungary. They all had complicated migration stories to tell. Many of them had come from Bácska. They'd come from the other direction, from Szeged. They were coming because of land shortage, above all, in their home communities. And the Germans who came from Bácska earlier in the 18th century had come all the way down the Danube from Bavaria, again, motivated, in part at least, by an economic process, driving them to build a better life in Central Europe. And so my question to Attila is, how far is it justified to talk about a migration turn in our contemporary era of globalization? Isn't this really a return rather than a turn? It's a return to normal historical processes, at least historical processes that have been normal since capitalism started shaking up agrarian communities throughout Central Europe. And perhaps I can push this continuity argument even further. I mean, after all, the Hungarians are not the original inhabitants of the Carpathian Basin. You don't go back to that kind of history, and I'm not really seriously suggesting that you should engage with the archaeologists and all the archaeogeneticists who are telling us more about migration processes in prehistory. But what I am questioning here is, I'm pushing you to say more about the long-term historical dynamics. You do a wonderful job on the recent decades. Can you give any hint as to how your analysis, a Polanyian, Lukácsian, Gramscian analysis, might be operationalized over a longer historical period? That's my main question. A subordinate question, it follows from the little evidence I was giving you with a focus on that one region. Surely, Attila, it's not enough to come down to the level of countries, national societies, to distinguish Hungary from Estonia or from Romania. You need to look within Hungary to understand the patterns, also the patterns of emigration that we are observing today. There are vast differences between those regions that were depopulated in the pre-capitalist centuries, Turkish occupation, and those areas of Western Hungary, which have a very different population history, as you know better than I do. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much. It's been a privilege to comment on this fantastic work. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your contribution. And I would like to call József Böröc to comment the topic of migration turn and the book as well from your perspective.
Good evening or afternoon to all of you in Budapest. Sziasztok! And happy Bengali New Year. April 14 happens to be the Bengali New Year this year. A mere 265 million people all over the world are celebrating that. And before I start my comments, I want to explain my t-shirt. I'm wearing this because my employer, Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey, is currently on strike. There is a total shutdown of the university that happened about 5 days ago. Faculty, all other employees, graduate workers, part-time lecturers, we all marched. There is a very long and ambitious list of demands, and there is no end in sight. So, in fact, I'm going to preface everything, my entire presence here, by pointing it out that I'm not doing this as part of my service to Rutgers University, because I am on strike, right? I'm doing this as service to friendship, collegiality, and scholarship, to the extent that that's even possible in my case. Anyway, I also wanted to begin by saying, just as Professor Han did, that this is a very difficult genre that I agreed to do here. It is difficult in general to talk about a book in 10 minutes, especially about such an incredibly well crafted volume as the one we have been asked to read. The psychology of this whole thing works in such a way that part of my problem is that essentially there is nothing wrong with the book. I can't point at anything that I disagree with. And it's really difficult to find, how should I say, laudatory adjectives to fill a 10-minute slot. So I will just do it up front that this is a fantastic tour de force. And the way I see it, since the author and I have been friends for 3 decades now, that this is a very high level and concise, extremely well thought out synthesis of pretty much all the engagements that intellectual engagements that Attila has had. It was a long time coming, and I'm very glad that it is there. It is very tightly argued and very readably organized book, and I think it will find its way in graduate student training, as well as on the shelves of colleagues who work on issues such disparate issues as the transformations of global capitalism, population discourses, and of course migration. Anyway, I have a couple of not particularly ambitious comments and questions. I'm posing them not so much as a form of examining Attila, but to all of us to sort of think about, at least certainly the signaling that that's what I was thinking about. One point, Attila mentioned it in the introduction also just now, that the societies of East Central Europe overall were not poor at all during the socialist period. In fact, they did quite well. I think a more important point is that they did very well even in comparison to the measurable economic indices of their position in the world. They were occupying between 100 and 140% of, or in some cases even higher, of the world average per capita income throughout this period. But if you actually look at indicators of quality of life, such as life expectancy at birth and the various other measures of culture, as well as health and so on, they were doing even over and beyond that. So as an example, I should just point it out that Albania, for instance, which was the poorest of all of the countries in our region, had a life expectancy at birth that was between 10 and 20 years longer than the expected value for those societies that were not socialist on the same level of economic performance as Albania was. So what I was asking myself as I'm reading this material, what is the significance of this additional loss? Because of course, what happened with the collapse of socialism is that not only that the economic performance, strictly speaking, of these societies went down, but they also lost their relative advantages in quality of life, which were greater than their economic performance, the advantages in terms of their economic performance. So the tragedies were greater than what the economic indices show. That's all I'm trying to say here. This is a really important question, I think, certainly from my perspective. The other thing I wanted to mention is that the book does some really brave things, such as including a multivariate regression analysis in chapter 3. Well, not quite showing the table in the main text, but that one can find the table in the appendix. One interesting findings that it shows is that it is a comparison of a modernizationist and the world systems, the variables that are associated with modernization theory and those associated with world systems analysis. It examines the fit of those variables with outcomes such as migration. And it finds that when compared to world systems the world systems-based model, modernization theory is not even near. It essentially is completely, it turns out to be a fully irrelevant model. And there is a third column for each of the periods that Attila did data for, and that is the joint model, meaning including both modernization and world systems variables trying to predict migration outcomes. And those joint models are worse, meaning they perform not better, but worse, statistically speaking, than strictly the world systems model. In other words, adding the modernization variables actually decreases the predictive value of our analysis. It's actually a complete mistake to even start talking in modernizationist terms. And so once we have that evidence, there have been other work that has done this, but it's a very elegant and very sort of concise way to present this in this book, and so I love it. And once we have this evidence, my only question to you all, Attila, you don't have to answer it, but I'm just going to let it hang there, which is why are we even worrying about modernization theory anymore? What's wrong with us? I mean, that thing has been debunked at least 50 years ago or so, and we're still apparently teaching it. I mean, not those of us here, but our professions and so on. So I guess my question is why? And let's see. I also wanted to, I would like Attila to sort of, to invite Attila to sort of give some thoughts to. And that is, I think the biggest trauma in all this for me is, of course, the analytical finding that the discursive structures that surround migration have essentially bifurcated into two positions, one being a neoliberal global market-based model, the other being something that posits itself as a counter-hegemonic argument, but in fact it reinforces that, and that is the nationalist, narrow-minded, sort of a retreat into a nationalist cave. And so that is the bifurcation that we have here. That is the ideological landscape right now, certainly in Hungary. And but you know, it's not that different from the United States actually also. And so what obviously the big trauma is that there is no tertium datur, as Attila pointed out. There is no other how should I say, meaningful, coherent, plausible kind of conversation politically or even in mainstream scholarly discourse, you know, with some exceptions. And what I'd like to understand is why that is. And especially the role of what is casually referred to in this book and in the literature overall as, quote, race, unquote, in that. And the reason why I'm asking that is, for my money, both the neoliberal approach as well as the nationalist approach are racist. They're race-based cognitions. And therefore, the conclusion is that there is no non-racist mainstream ideological position that is available to the populations of the 8 billion people on planet Earth right now. Why? Why is that? Anyway, these were some of my comments. The rest, there are more, but I can't read them at this moment. And I think I'm running out of time anyway. So thank you. This was a very lovely experience.
Thank you, József, for your comments and the great questions. Attila is sitting next to me and started thinking about the answers. So later on, she will have the opportunity to answer these questions or start thinking about that. So Petra, I would like to ask you to continue with the comments and maybe questions too.
Hello, everybody. I'm so sorry that I'm not able to be there, even I planned to go to Budapest. I would like to congratulate Attila for his excellent book. It's really rich, and for me as someone who is anthropology, studying care migration, is still very, very relevant because it's bringing in new knowledge and expertise in the field of history, economy, and politics of the region. And I think the book is quite relevant also because there are not so many books on migration in Central and Eastern Europe, but also he's trying to find really original connection between migration, transformation of society, marketization, and precarization, which also involves the expansion of structural positions of social insecurity, negative flexibility, and low pay. So even after accession to EU, we still see the importance of borders in the region, in fact. Even today, borders, as we see in the data, mediate the production of the subordinate inclusion of a disposable labor force, as, for example, Nicolas de Genova is arguing. And this is represented by migrants. And in our region, this production of marginalized and disposable labor force for EU markets coexist with a narrative of borderless Europe that emerged after 1989. And in Central Europe, this was accompanied by a narrative of catching up with the West, which partially legitimized gradual dismantling of public care services, in fact, like child care facilities, as well as residential senior care facilities, and a weakening of social redistribution. The cross-border labor market, which is a part of our migration ways in the region or forums, not necessarily involve long-distance migrants, but in the region of Central Eastern Europe, it's built on the formalized path for the subtle combination of inclusion within the European Union through the access to labor markets, and also exclusion from some labor rights protections. And the realm of social rights through systematically neglecting migrant social and care needs in different life phases, for example, and the responsibilities for their own families. And plus this, national social policies do not reckon with the mobility of citizens and their transnational lives and social rights. And what we see instead is the persistent territorialization of social rights, which categorizes migrants as second-class people. For me, as a care migration scholar, it was really interesting when I was reading the book, when Attila, and I know it from his other work and from the conferences, he shows really interesting key macro statistical data. And we can see that the region is facing serious demographic and migration challenges. Structural challenges due to the globalization, as Attila is arguing, have not been favorable for solving the increasing combined problem of aging on one hand and the increased care needs. So this exchange, as he says, may lead to a care drain in home countries, because of course aging in different parts of this region is following more or less the same trajectory. We know that some countries are better off, like Czech Republic or Slovakia, but some of them are really having troubles. And consequently, demand for care work is increasing everywhere, yeah, just in our region, EU, but also globally. So what is also important for me to read from Attila's book is the role of out-migration, because he's really stressing that out-migration has also played a role in this increase of care needs, because the moving away of younger age groups has significantly changed the population composition. Such a shift in the age composition clearly requires a relative increase in care, as he says. Yeah, so, but it seems that these public resources are really limited, and perhaps, and also some governments are really not willing to cover it, yeah, especially those conservative ones we have, for example, now in the Czech Republic. They're making just cuts right now. So Attila shows really interesting data from 2000 to 2016, when he shows that growth in per capita economic income, and I'm referring directly to this book, was 20 percentage points less than growth in per capita healthcare expenditures. So meanwhile, population age, the combined ratio of tax revenues and contribution to GDP remained unchanged and has declined sharply since 2018's crisis. So this means, according to Attila, that the income needed for additional per capita health spending, which exceeded the level of economic growth, has been generated from extra private sources. So it means that people have to use more money from their own pockets, from their own income, to buy the commodity of care, healthcare or senior care, childcare, and or the share of non-health redistributive spending has decreased, and thus more public money has to be spent on healthcare services, which in fact we are not observing in many countries in the regions, as I said, due to the cuts, all the crises we went through. What I found also interesting, or what would be super interesting for me, if Attila could think about the future perspective of care crisis, because definitely his book is showing that we are going through the care crisis. And it's related partially also to the agenda of migration or out migration. So I would like to know something more about the role of privatization and a financialization of senior care, for example, on the one hand, and if he sees also the role of the rise of conservative social politics, because those are highlighting familialistic models of care, which are free. They are done by unpaid reproductive work of family members, female family members. And we know that women in the region are already facing gender inequalities related to high pay gap, lower pensions, etc. Yeah, we know that single mothers and senior women in our region are quite often on the poverty line. And we know from Brigitte Allenbacher work, whose work you are familiar with, that she's following Karl Polanyi's argument that care has increasingly become a fictitious commodity because families or state cannot really play, they're not playing active role in covering care needs. Care has become increasingly marketized, and of course, migration is one of the care fixes. We know that care workers from Central Eastern Europe are playing a really important role of fixing the problem, and also we do observe another forms of those fixes as care relocation of seniors from Western Europe to Central Eastern Europe for cheaper care. And we know society really cannot fully marketize social reproduction, because otherwise the society could not survive, as Nancy Fraser is, for example, arguing. So I really do not observe any alternatives now for the future in terms of this form of care, both senior care or child care, as caring communities or care cooperatives in the region, but perhaps I'm wrong. So then another solution could be just to put more public investment and infrastructural and financial support for care in the future. But this is not happening due to the crisis and due to the conservative governments we are having right now in the region. So again, my question is for you, where do you see a potential for solving a care crisis? And you are proving this crisis in your book from more socially sensitive perspective in our region, not a neoliberal one. So that's all from my side.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Petra, and I give the microphone to Prem.
Thank you. Attila's disappeared. Thank you. It's an honor to be here, Attila. Thank you for the invitation. It was a pleasure to read the book, a very large book, and it was a pleasure for many reasons, not only because, as others have said, the systematic and important historical scholarship that really shows migration as a driver for the social and political ordering of our time that we're experiencing now, social, political, and cultural ordering of our time that we're experiencing now. And as you know from different types of conversations that we've had, we share one thing in common. In that sense, we both think migration is an important historical engine. It's a historical engine that explains the nature of the cultural, economic, and political ordering of our time. And I use the word ordering because these are processual, these are ongoing, as I think Attila says. And Attila thinks about this much more systematically than me, so I'm going to say a few things which may be a little bit convoluted, but I hope they can connect to what you're saying. And they're to do with your histories from where you begin. And I'm going to talk a little bit about imperialism in 1 minute, because that is picked up on in your in the beginning of your book, but it's not really elaborated. And I think it's important to think about, as we think about histories of Europe and histories of migration to Europe, from which point do we begin? Think about it from the point of imperialism. And then I want to talk very briefly about the emerging historical bloc that you've elaborated. I have a slightly different articulation of that. And then I want to end with this, this very evocative way in which you end the book when you talk about Europe being provincialized and what can come next. And there can be, I think, something next, something beyond the historical blocks that you're articulating. But to start all of this, I think we can begin by taking very seriously what you put forward via Polanyi, as labor as a fictitious commodity and migration as a fictitious commodity. And taking that seriously, one thing it shows, a fictitious commodity is something that truncates, that reduces, that is a representation of a complex history, a complex set of processes, relations, movements, connections that become reduced to this term called migration, that can sit on top of and contain the complexity of human mobility. So there's much to be said about that. I just want to say that perhaps one way of thinking about that is that if we connect this, if we think about imperialism, we think about migration as connecting to imperialism, what we can see, first of all, is that of the two blocks that you say, and it connects back to Jozef's points and the inherent racism of those two blocks, the block that we understand as globalization or neoliberal, etc., can also be understood as the block that creates economic, cultural, and political conditions that enables the value extraction of the body power of some of the most impoverished, dispossessed people on our planet. So I think what's important when we think about, if we start from imperialism, we start thinking about European histories of migration or histories to Europe of migration, then we shift things a little bit. We think about what has happened so that the same people over time, people caught under similar types of conditions over time, move. What are the connections between migration and the forms of dispossession that we see in colonialism and the imperialist strategies that connect to ongoing forms of value drain, exploitation, and dispossession? So it might be interesting to think about this question to you, Attila. Maybe I've got all of the wrong end of the stick, but to think about histories of migration to Europe, the construction of the two blocks as one is being deeply connected to attempts to make durable the extraction of value of groups of people. And then what we see then also is a differentiation between different forms of migration. There are groups of people who are often undocumented, people who are caught immobilized in Europe, in the agricultural sector in Europe, for example, as ways of really increasing the possibility of value drain and value accumulation and value cloistering in a small, relatively small European white elite. And then, and then for me, this connects to the idea of of the current conjuncture and the current historical block, the emerging historical block. And I think what's important is thinking about how is if we see migration as, of course, differentiated, there are multiple forms of migration. There are groups of people who are brought into Europe in order to brought into Europe in ways that further their value drain, that further the accumulation of wealth and so on. What we see now is the coming together of a conservative, you call it, populist bloc on migration, and a racist bloc. The neoliberal, modernist, globalized bloc is racism becomes much more clear, and you see it coming together. You see it coming together in ways that enable, first of all, the cultural denigration of migrants, the cultural cheapening of migrants, placing them outside of the norm, enabling then the extraction of value from them in durable ways. So they're outside of the norm. They're, in John Berger's words way back in 1975, the deproletarianization of the migrant, of the seventh man. Yeah, so outside of the systems because they have been cast as outsiders. And I think here you see that the historical bloc, which, Central Europe is a driver of that, but it's when the populist discourses become find the connections that were already there. They were imminent in the so-called globalized, market-oriented, globalizing, pro-migrant bloc, which is also, a racist imperialist bloc, perhaps. And you see this in some things. For example, European Union now. Migration matters, broadly speaking. European Union fall under the new commissioner for the promotion of our European way of life. So this is where migration is talked about from the perspective of the EU institutions. It used to be protecting our European way of life, or that was the aim, but they changed it to promoting at the last minute. But then, I still feel that there are possibilities, there are openings, there are other ways out of that. And I think that you hint to that when you talk about the provincialization of Europe. And I think if we begin again from the idea that there are migrant laborers who are immobilized in Europe in ways that enable the draining of their value, we suddenly think about how this is a practice that occurs in neoliberal Europe, in whatever adjective we want to use, capitalist, modernist Europe, is a practice of extracting value that perhaps has very specialized functions and is starkest towards migrant, but exists towards other communities in Europe, and is increasingly become generalized as a way of extracting value from people through whatever they are, 0-hour contracts, all sorts of legal administrative innovations. And this points perhaps to the construction of new forms of solidarity, new forms of community, new forms of solidarity and community beyond the migrant-citizen divide, but I mean, to be a bit reductive, towards class solidarities, perhaps providing a vantage point for stepping outside of the quite depressing historical blocks that are dominating our contemporary age. Thank you, Attila. I hope it was clear. It's been very inspiring thinking with your book.
Thank you very much, Prem. And I would like to ask Salvatore to continue with his comments and remarks.
Jó estét kívánok! Köszönöm szépen a meghívást. I also wish I could be there rather than here in the sweltering heat of the northeast of the United States. I would like to express my full solidarity with Rutgers University at the moment as someone who got a PhD there with the help of Professor Burrett and with the mentoring of Professor Burrett, even more importantly. It is especially important for me to see this turn of events there, and hopefully it will be much better than my experience had been there as someone who was trying to unionize. Anyway, thank you also for reminding us of the New Year in the Bengali communities. It's rather important to me as well to be more aware of what's going on in most of the rest of the planet. I mean, I'll try not to be redundant. I am fortunate in some respects of building upon what has already been said. I would also have basically nothing but praise. This is a wonderful volume. In fact, one of the things I would like to add is that if this would have been a novel, it actually worked quite well, because there was always this postponement as to like what the results are, and that actually kept me going, like flipping, going through the pages. I couldn't wait to get, to the next page. So I thought that was quite well done in that respect as well. Perhaps it wasn't planned that way, but it certainly worked, at least for me. But perhaps I might not represent many folks who read books of this sort in that way. Of course, as a geographer, someone who deals with soils, and there is I'm a bit in an embarrassed outsider perspective, but at the same time, and again, thanks to the mentorship of both Melegh Attila and Burrett József, I am not completely as much an outsider as I would otherwise have been. I would have 5 questions at least. Some of them are overlapping with what has already been asked or commented, and one of them is with respect to what Petra ended with, especially. What do you see as a pro-development critical discourse? That's something that again, this volume, I just want to preface all these questions with saying that the questions that have come up for me, and I trust also for others among us, it just reflects how generative this volume is of further questions, of inspiring further kinds of research. And so this is one of them. What do you recognize as a pro-development critical discourse, and could this be the one way of articulating a politics that would be more socially sensitive, as Professor Ezzedine put it? And my second question comes from my environmental geography and people environments research in particular. One of the things that I learned quite a bit from what Attila wrote was to read Malthus in a different way than I have read so far. In fact, to go back to what Professor Burrett was saying, it's just like, well, one could also include, why even have any of this Malthusian nonsense? I mean, how is it possible that this could even be countenanced at all? It's such rubbish. And yet it is rather important, politically still. And I see it much more in environmental movements than I do with respect to the I suppose political, other kinds of political movements that Attila is referring to in the book. I found it striking that since the 1970s, the Malthusian perspective that was being promoted, especially among folks, intellectuals who are maybe representing fractions of the ruling class, especially in the North, that kind of politics, that kind of ideology has been on the wane since the 1970s, but I'm actually seeing that it has a persistence within the environmental movement, this Malthusian perspective. Of course, Garrett Hardin is one of the main proponents who picked up on Malthus in terms of a politics of migration that is rather gruesome, to say the least, for any of you who is familiar with Garrett Hardin's eugenicist ideology. Because just like what Professor Burrett was saying, it's basically a lot of racism couched in different ways that we are being presented with. But in any case, what I learned out of reading Attila's book was also my lack of attentiveness to Malthus's writings on migration, which now I recognize are really quite important, even for me in the classroom, to impart to my students. There seems to be this discrepancy between how Malthus viewed migration compared to the essentialism with respect to the working class in England. For those of you who are familiar with Malthus, maybe I should elaborate more on this. I'm not sure what to presume, but how do you see this discrepancy in any case between this populationist argument, with respect to migration, in particular persisting in environmentalism, but being on the wane in other sectors of society? I mean, I don't see this just in politics, in environmental politics. I see this also in the environmental sciences. It's a recurring trope, which is rather, to say the least, worrisome, since a lot of these folks are involved in climate science as well. Which brings me to another issue that is related. Well, with respect to, perhaps in the audience you might be familiar with this. I don't know how resonant it is in the region. It certainly is resonant here in North America, and that's the concept of climate refugees. And what I really appreciated about what you wrote, Attila, in the book is actually resisting the facile argumentation of environmental refugees. And you just touched upon it in the book. And I mean, maybe as someone who is steeped in these kinds of struggles against certain kinds of ideologies, like environmental determinism and Malthusianism, or neo-Malthusianism, perhaps I would have liked to see more about it, but I think it's just as well that it wasn't covered so much. But I guess in your view, perhaps if you had the chance to write more about, for example, issues of what I've regarded as climate refugees, I mean, because it takes the imaginary of many people, because of climate change. If you would have devoted more time to it, or if you would have had more room to do it in the book, how would your critique, what would your critique look like for the specific context of Central and Eastern Europe? In terms of, is this like the concept of climate refugee marginal as in terms of any political resonance there? I mean, I get the sense that it is, but not having lived there in Hungary for a while, I'm not sure. I'm too disconnected. But it certainly is something that resonates with a lot of academics who are involved in environmental issues. And I find it very worrisome because this is what I like about you raising Lukács, so the concept of reification. And this seems to be one of those issues in which environmental degradation is being reified as having causal power, rather than capitalist relations that lead to the problem in the first place, including the environmental one. And then a fourth question, and this goes again back to kind of the first in some respects. So maybe it's an elaboration of my first question. What do you see as political strategies? What would you recommend as political strategies in the region, perhaps, but maybe even at the global level, to struggle against this, I guess, Janus-faced racism and patriarchal understanding of the world, that is to say, the pro-market and anti-migrant politics? So, what would you suggest? What would you see as the kinds of political forces and that could effectively struggle against these two facets of basically the same overarching process? And my fifth and last question is kind of related to what Professor Hahn was talking about, and also Professor, I'm not sure whether there's an interest in this, an open question. What do you see as possibly the effects of internal migration patterns on the politics about migration. So I say this because of the experiences I've had since childhood. I mean, in northern Italy, I'm a half southerner, so you have these kinds of anti-southerner things going on, and then you have anti-Roma sentiment that's throughout Italy for a long time, and that's internal migration. That there's also internal displacement of people in a massive way, like from southern to northern Italy. In the US, you have the race riots against African Americans, trying to find a way out of the horrors of the rural south of the United States and being met by death, like lynchings. How do these internal migration patterns, like forced, economically induced, or what have you, racialized, how do they play out at the scale in between countries? Because those are the units of analysis that you're playing with, and I understand that. But perhaps the internal dynamics, which is what I think Professor Han was also alluding to, but also in some respects, Professor Rajaram, from outside of the the region that you're looking at, and you touched on this in some respects with South Africa, but how would they play out in terms of the overall politics in between countries as well? So thank you very much for your attention. I can't wait to have the discussion about all these.
Thank you, Salvatore. Thank you for all the questions and comments you raised here now. And I'm sure that these 30 minutes we are going to have for the answer, and the discussion will be not enough, but there are many opportunities and channels to continue the discussion. But now I give the floor to Attila, who can give his best to answer.
Okay. First of all, thank you very much. I think rarely happens that you have to think very deeply when you are listening to people, and all your comments are right into the heart of the problems which I've been struggling with. First, I would like to nonetheless make one point, is that I'm glad that this book is readable, but that is very much due to Kyra Lyublyanovich, who has been an excellent translator of this text from Hungarian. So we have to applaud her. For the excellent job she has been doing, because this has helped the book a lot. Now, concerning the points, I think let me go one by one. So, Chris, what you're asking is the first thing, what Polányi would say about this, or what Lukács would say about this. I think I don't know the answer of Lukács, to be honest. He has also not written about migration. But Polányi, I think Polányi would do the same, seeing the same development, like in the case of, he would say that money cannot be made equal to a marketized version of capitalist economy, and it cannot be just one category. It has to be analyzed according to uses, social context, institutional structures. So we have to decompose it, like he has done with money, for instance. And then we cannot make it some kind of a starting point. So this migration as an abstract category, which has been created during the last 3 decades, is actually one of the most striking developments, plus one of the biggest traps in thinking in various ways concerning this. Because I think this trap is not only for the nationalists, but even for the critiques. Because instead of, as Prem is also pointing to this, recontextualizing migration, dividing it up, making these linkages absolutely clear, even those who are very rightly fighting for unprivileged people, they make a mistake. And actually, this is one of the answers to other questions, made an unholy alliance with the marketeers in a lot of ways. And I think this is one of the reasons why the critique is actually missing in a lot of ways. So that would be point number one. But I think I firmly believe in this, that Polanyi would say no, let's go back to things, and of course he would do a very thorough global historical analysis of the whole story. That is to say, how it came up again and again. The other, the longer term perspectives and whether migration has become normal. In that sense, I am dubious, because I think one of the points of the book, and me working on migration as well, is there is no such thing as normal or normalized migration, because it's all part of social change. And I think Hein de Haas is also making this point, and actually the whole book is based on this, that migration cannot be understood on an individual rational behavior, cannot be understood in just in certain perspectives, but we have to put at mass migration has to be put into social change. And this is what we need to understand. So in that sense, socialism also had normal migration, but it was solving the things very differently. So when it was, organized labor repatriation in, let's say, certain projects were done in East Germany or certain projects were done in the Soviet Union, that was according to this very interesting mixed economies or planned economies, how they were doing. And as far as we know from analysis, those migrants were not completely unhappy about these projects in many ways. So the point what I'm trying to make is that, and that actually, this is why it's difficult to give a good answer to Prem as well, because what you are pointing at is that after this book, there's a need to write another big book when you actually recontextualize these processes, and one by one you go through. I see already a 4-volume book emerging out of this, in case all the specific links and historical social context are taken into account, just even with regard to a small region, right? And that, I think, is what Chris is also talking about. So the Hungarian Great Plain, how it was receiving various inflows of migrants from the mountains of Transylvania or from Swabia or various parts of the world, that we all know we have to make very serious work. This is why I always admire, and actually I feel ashamed when social anthropologists are reading my book, because I know that they are unable to see these concrete linkages for which they are looking for. So in that sense, I am aware of it. It's one of the problems of this book. But that would be the answer. And of course, what Chris and Salvatore is also asking, how internal this uprootedness is related to external, and how the whole thing can be understood. That's an absolutely relevant point. Actually, the book has only one, for me, new finding in this respect, that in this development of global capitalism, first, the marketized idea of migration was invented concerning national displacement. So up to the 1970s, there was a massive talk about urban-rural migration. And this urban-rural migration was seen as a solution for all kinds of poverty problems, for all kinds of developmental problems, and this was promoted. And then later came this idea, let's say, I analyzed very seriously the World Bank documents. Actually, I downloaded 20,000 of them, and then I analyzed 1,500 out of that. So in that sense, what you can see is that in the beginning, they talk about migration as a marketized abstract category concerning internal developmental problems, and then they externalize it. And then they make it as a global project. And actually what we have seen during the last decades is this global project, how it has been working. It's been promoted massively. So we have to be very clear that not many people will be happy when what I'm saying is that when the Hungarian Prime Minister makes some references to the United Nations, that they have also a project, that's correct. Okay, in that sense, that's correct. The question is how we do the critique. That's I think, where the whole thing really comes up. So the internal displacement or the internal uprootedness, and absolutely, that's very important. And then to the richness of human mobility, as Prem says, is really something which first we should see instead of this super, in some ways stupid, simplified, abstract category, which some people would say that this is what science needs, but I think science can be actually much more precise in these things. Now, the next thing is, of course, Joseph is asking extremely important questions. And of course, I'm not going to answer them fully. The first thing is, yes, for me, also working a lot with verse system theory, actually it was striking how well it worked. The other thing was a little bit more striking for me, why these models and questions have not been translated into such modeling, like in the book. And actually this is something which is missing. But that's, that's the problem of our social science, is that verse system theory is unable to make by modernization into the mainstream in that sense. By modernization theories, of course. We understand the political power games behind the whole story, so don't think that I am completely absent-minded in this, but I think there is a point in the book that, and I was very glad that the result, what you could see, really what came out. Nonetheless, let me defend modernization theory in one thing. Both word system theory and in some ways the so-called migration hump theory, which says that, let's say, the middle income countries would be the most emigrant countries, that is not actually true. I think Hein de Haas is also making a point, is that when societies are becoming richer, the migration capabilities are increasing dramatically, which means that even among rich countries, you have a rather huge migration. That I think can be shown. In that sense, I can defend, because this is Zelensky, and this is, the transition in some ways, but this depends very much on income, the increase of income. Concerning your point, Joseph, and I think in Salvatore is coming to that as well. Yeah, of course they are racist. That was the least surprising thing for me in that respect. All of them are using racist or Eurocentric hierarchies in certain ways. This is actually clear in the book as well. I try to make it clear again and again, although I think that was not the point of the book now to show it. And then I'm glad that other people, including you, Joseph, are working on these things. And that's very important. The question is, and then of course I'm not surprised, because the biopolitical discourses of capitalism are going to be biopolitical discourses of capitalism, meaning that it's going to be about the various use of mass body and how it can be best utilized, value extraction, as Prem pointed this out. I'm not going to be surprised that there are certain hierarchies are going to be used in this, and then this is going to be also institutionalized in many ways. The question is really, and what Salvatore is asking all the time from me, I like this, what is the outcome? Well, the outcome is not going to come from me. I think really the good question is, why the critique of market? Because this is the tertium datur, right? Because both blocks, both the nationalist bloc is pro-market, so Jobke is correct, neoliberal nationalism in a lot of ways. Although we have to qualify it in the case of Eastern Europe a little bit. I will come back to this. And, the pro-market bloc, both things are problematic because they lack the systematic critique of market, and this leads to certain things. Now, why in the society, not among us, it is not gaining things? That's a long story. First of all, there were political systems which have been trying to maintain that, but as in the book you can read, even in socialism, this massive systematic critique was rather quickly forgotten. And therefore it did not become really a kind of a social practice. So we can just say that, look, I don't know. when the societal critique is going to die. For me, nonetheless, this enormous debate on migration and the tensions around that is a clear warning that societies in the neoliberal era are absolutely dissatisfied with certain patterns. They would like to have much more security, much clearer ways ahead, and they are revolting. The question is in what direction they are revolting. That's, a big question at the moment. But they are revolting, which means that the thing is not working, as Polanyi would have also warned us all the time, right? So in that sense, I think this. But thank you very much for drawing the attention to this. Yes, one of the key things is that migration has been so powerful, including because of the racist elements of that as well, is to become a dominant bifurcation, right? Because previously population discourses were much more diverse, and now we have these blocks. And that, I think, was a major outcome of the book. Now, Petra very carefully went into some kind of analysis, which I really like, and even I would say that I like the most sometimes. Because in case we go into details of this, how migration has been developing, why migration is going up, why, in this capitalist political economy, how this thing is actually institutionalized, that there are certain traps. That is to say that we are seeing very important tensions at another very important Polanyian thing called care. And then we can see that the outcome from this is, first of all, because of social change. It's very much now based on some kind of struggle between the state and the market. And the market is coming out of this as a winner, also because of the demographic changes previously, also because the inequality things. I just give you one example. All East European countries are trapped to achieve a high level of economic growth in order to survive in these things. Now, what do you need for a high economic growth? You need to attract more and more capital, and then you are going to start the story again and again, and then this just goes like this. So in that sense, these traps are very, very important. And to be honest, I was glad. I was very sad but I found it, important. It gave me insight in the book. What is going to be the future prospect? I think I'm not a future teller, so I have no crystal ball. But I can see once again that these neoliberal tensions are really building up in crucial spheres of human life, which means we really need to look for alternative solutions. I think societies actually started experimenting with all kinds of things concerning even care. The question is, what is our duty in this as intellectuals? And I see one duty is that we have to, based on historical analysis, we have to make it clear which institutional patterns are problems in the spread of these alternatives. Because why alternatives are unable to flourish, why they are not able to gain a momentum in this, when it is obviously crystal clear that the marketized care, that global capital is taking old German bodies to the Polish border and then clean them with Moldavian workers. These are not really something what we would like to see in our life or in our family in a lot of ways. So in that sense, I think this is there. Now, two more things, and I hope I'm trying to do this. The special process of Europe and then this provincialization of Europe, Joseph has, his book has been mentioned, it's very, very important in this respect. In the case of migration, actually, the provincialization of Europe is something which we have to, because we have to see that Europe, the migration rate of Europe, in terms of what proportion of migrants it is taking out from the global migrants. Now, this is really the time when it is above its economic weight, which means that in case theoretically we think it over, Europe is really seeing something, a new scenario. So we cannot deny that in this respect, especially in case biopolitical discourses as such are in operation. Otherwise, it would not be that a big problem. Okay, one more thing concerning the political economy, which Prem was asking about. Of course, it's a great missing part of the book. I have to tell you that I have not really worked on this issue of the political economy, value extraction, where value is coming from, and so on and so on. And once again, there is an enormous, debates which migrant group is in which context. Are you a person who is doing care from Canti Bologna, and then you go to Austria in between households, and basically you are a household servant, like in all the agrarian societies, or it is a marketized system in which certain profit-seeking entrepreneurs are putting you there and there and there. Now, these are very big questions. I'm thinking about it. I have witnesses in this audience that I'm really thinking about this, but that's once again, I think it's another book. Now, two more things. Salvatore, I hope that I'm coming back. Look, I think Malthus. Malthus is of course, Malthus first of all was proven wrong in all his assumptions. That's what we know as in historical demography. Nonetheless, as a discourse, this is one of the most successful discourses ever, because I think this is about resources, competition, and then who is to be supported in this and who is not to be supported, which is the key language of capitalism. In a whole lot of ways. And that, I think, what keeps Malthus alive. For me, what was shocking to see how the Malthusian argument was really promoting a lot this marketization. And that was really surprising for me in the book, because I was expecting something else in that sense. That, I think, is also related to the environmentalist debates and Malthusianism, right? But to be honest, I think the answer is the system is too powerful to promote these discourses, and this is why environmentalists are not finding a way out of this. So I would a little bit reverse it. What pro-developmental discourses can do, and then I think I've already answered that. And then the last point is, of course, education. Yes, I think, and then with this I come back to the point of Chris in the beginning. Yes, I can see that Lukács and Polányi are sitting in Vienna. Cory Polányi says who is going to be 100 June 14. Cory Polányi told me several times personally that they communicated. Most probably they were reading each other a lot, and I think both of them were thinking about one very important problem. What does it mean for society and social consciousness when the market becomes dominant and super dominant? And I think both of them were really working on these issues. And this is why we need to celebrate Lukács as well, because reification comes from History and Class Consciousness, which was published finally exactly 100 years ago. So with this, I'm thanking everybody. Sorry, they asked two good questions. This is why it was so long. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I promised the audience the opportunity to raise questions. And if you still have the energy and capacity, please go ahead with your comment or questions. Questions are more welcome. So, because they can continue discussing the main points endlessly, but I think the audience is exhausted. So they are tired. Then I asked the speakers that, do you want to react to Attila's replies? Of course, he couldn't answer everything in detail, and it will be, he promised 4 more volumes or something like that. So it takes time. But if you want to, yeah, József raised his hand. So please, József.
Just one question, Attila, when is this coming out in Magyar?
There are two problems at the moment. This has been submitted to this academic doctorate process. Although it could come out, but actually I applied for funds. It's written in Hungarian. I applied for funds to publish it, but they told me that till it is in the process of this academic doctorate, I'm not going to get any funds. And I've been financing this book for quite a while, and my family, very, very patient, very supportive family as well. And I think we have to see some of the limits in this respect, that to fully finance this book would be some kind of an issue. But let's wait till this academic process is there. I am in contact with Napvilág Kiadó, and they are open. This is what they told me in that sense. So it's foreseen. And I think for me, being in this country, seeing this dramatic political debate going on in my country, I think for me as a critical person, it's a must that it has to come out in Hungarian as well. Because I have to share it with my own community as well. Thank you.
Okay. So, yeah, we have a question. You have to speak.
Hi, Attila. Thank you very much. Having not read the book and just been listening to your summary, I was struck by one thing you said that was really interesting about, I think you called it competitive anxiety, to explain the sort of the current condition. I was wondering, could you say a bit more about that? So I was really struck by that throughout all of the discussions. It just keeps coming back to me thinking about and explaining for so much of many of the issues, not only relating to migration, but relating to care or education or so many things that seem to be so important in the region right now.
Very important question. That was actually one of the hints for me not to fall into traps. So I looked at attitude surveys back to the 1990s, and the attitude surveys, especially the comparative ones. And what are these competitive anxieties? Let's say migrants are coming and taking away your job, which is a kind of a classic question. And then what you could find, for instance, for the case of this country, was the following: that since the mid-1990s, we were one of the most anxious societies in these comparative frameworks. Even from 2002, in case you look at the European Social Survey, we never got worse than silver medal in this question. Now, but once again, do not misunderstand me. This is for understanding. How is that possible that these countries are so anxious about these things? And this actually explains a lot of things in another way, right? So it's not the Orban government which is creating these things, but the Orban government sits on these things, and politicians are sitting onto these things. Now, the answer to this, at least this is my bet, but my analysis is, hopefully it's demonstrating this as well, that some of the East European socialist societies, especially the Czechs and the Hungarians, in some ways the Estonians as well, when they got into this dramatic opening up, then during that period, very early, they also got immigration. So for instance, in case you worked in that, Gergő Pulai is sitting there as well, and the other people as well is sitting there, which means this, how Hungarian ethnic groups were seen as a competitive problem for the society here as early as the 1990s and the early 2000s, right? Now, this shows you that we got on a track. And then basically what happened with the refugee crisis, that, a further very big challenge came on this track already. And this is how actually it could work. But this competitiveness is very important. And I know in other surveys concerning, other welfare services and so, it's also very, very strong. So empirically, we can say that this can be one of the key kind of mechanisms how these linkages between globalization, nationalism, anti-migrant nationalism, and so on comes up. Okay.
Thank you for the question and for the answer. And I see Chris raised his hand. So Chris, go ahead with your.
Thank you. Just a quick question, Attila. Thanks for all the answers, all the rich discussion. I also hope that the book will appear in Hungarian very soon. I would like to continue my mental experiment, take you back once again to Kiskunhalas. You know that town so well. You were there in the local election campaign 4 years ago, when I was there too, September 2019. We met the mayor briefly, I'm sure you remember. This, for those of you who don't know the region, it is a stronghold of Fidesz. Fidesz dominates that council. It dominates in all of the villages around. This is an area close to the border. So the migration discourses of the Fidesz leadership, they resonate even better there, I would suggest, than in many other parts of the country. So if your book is available, Attila, do you see yourself accepting an invitation to visit our friends in Kiskunhalas, to present the book? Who is going to sell it in Kiskunhalas? Who is going to get your message across to the people who vote Orban every 4 years, every 5 years now at local level? How is this book going to make a difference in practice?
Well, I happily accept it, Chris, of course. I think, no, I think it's very important because I think the debates in Hungary are amazingly badly shaped, and I don't want to go into this in all sides. So this means that we have a duty to go to local discussions and then to have these things. Although I think we have to be absolutely clear that I think maybe we have to go back several times in order to that certain problems we can start working on, but it will need time. So it cannot be a short discussion. Otherwise, this discussion is going to end up in animosities, and that I think is something very important to figure out. But no, I fully agree. That's actually the point. For instance, one of the messages we have to make clear that don't be naive that not the market is, or the marketization is doing a lot of problems and tensions around you. And it should not be put into persons, but you should see the social relations in this, and that's going to be a much better guide. But let's do it. Can we do it together, Chris?
Thank you very much. I think that was a perfect closing sentence. And I would like to thank the speakers, Chris, Josef, Petra, Salvatore, and Prem. And of course, thank you, Attila, for your book and for your great replies. And thank you for the audience for staying with us until the very end. And we don't have any other things to do, just celebrate your book. And if I'm right, there is some wine for celebration. Yeah.
Just one thing, that you're more than welcome to stay with us, and there is some wine, not much. Unfortunately, online we are unable to provide you any drink at the moment. But one more thing I would like to mention, that here is a newspaper, Népszava. There's Ivan sitting behind, and he just made an interview concerning the book in beautiful Hungarian. But it's important because then this discussion can continue in the Hungarian media as well. Thank you very much for that as well. So thank you.